Welcome to a new edition of the Famous Interviews with Joe Dimino. On this episode, we talk with author, publisher, and former marketing executive Robert B. O'Connor. We caught up with this writer about his new book, Jeep Show, a Trouper at the Battle of the Bulge. His previous book, Gumptionade, a booster for your self-improvement plan. Two radically different books, both about morale. As a young man, Robert was a Phi Beta Kappa at Kenyon College, a marketing executive at Procter Gamble, then owner of an advertising agency. He founded his publishing house, OKPI. It's quite a story. Enjoy.
Robert, it's wonderful to meet you, sir. I appreciate you taking a minute out today.
My pleasure. It's great to be here with you, Joe, and your audience.
So let me begin our conversation with something that kind of turned everything upside down for a while, which was surviving the pandemic. Mm-hmm. How much of surviving and getting through that pandemic, how many waves were created that you're still experiencing now with your work and with writing?
You know, for me, the pandemic was not a life-shaking experience. I did get COVID once, never, life-threatening, but I was at the time trying to turn my ideas about the book that eventually became Jeep Show into a story that would be interesting to people. So my work was completely uninterrupted by COVID, and I had no commute and no office to go to anyways. So for me, it was not a trial and a tribulation, other than obviously being worried about everyone overall, and being a little bit worried about myself, my friends, and my family. But Joe, I would say I got off lightly. I did go through, I do understand, though, the idea of going through very tough times and kind of how you get through it. I became very interested several years ago about the concept of morale and how we do the hard things, how we survive or even flourish during the hard times. And I ended up writing, my first book was a nonfiction book called Gumptionade, the booster for your self-improvement plan. And it was really my way of getting my ideas organized, getting my ideas down on paper about morale and how morale is maintained during the tough times. I want to read for your listeners a short paragraph from the introduction of that book, because it really sums up an important point. My father kept a poster on his dresser. Mounted on cardboard, it was the size of a file folder. He must have seen it every day. The poster was a quote from Thomas Huxley, a 19th century British biologist. 10 words on a brown background. The words were, "Perhaps the most valuable result of all education is the ability to make yourself do the thing you have to do when it ought to be done, whether you like it or not." That quote really, really resonated with me when I was going through some personal hard times. Almost everybody does. And I became very, very interested in the concept of morale. As I said, I wrote a book, a nonfiction book about that, but I found out that the U.S. Army in World War II had a morale corps. They had enlisted soldiers and officers whose sole job was to maintain morale among troops, and of course sailors and airmen. And I found out about one specific individual, a gentleman named Jim Hetzer, who had been he was unsuccessful in his attempt to break into show business in New York in the late 1930s. But he volunteered for the Army during World War II, even though he had a rock-solid deferment as the father of a young child. He went for paratrooper, but the Army put him in the Morale Corps because of his show business background. And when I found out about this person and the Morale Corps, I thought this was an ideal follow-up to my nonfiction book about morale. Here was a chance to write a novel set in World War II, which of course interests me for many reasons, dealing with the topic of morale, but through the telling of a story of a Morale Corps soldier and his experiences in the Army, and particularly during the Battle of the Bulge. So that's how I came to write Jeep Show.
So talk to me a little bit about your childhood and what was it that made you become a storyteller or writer? What were kind of the seeds that were planted? Where were you born and raised, too?
I was born and raised in New Haven, Connecticut, and then my family moved right into New York City in the early to mid-'60s, which, I thought New York City was a paradise for children, but it's kind of hard on parents raising a family in New York City. So we ended up moving back to New Haven after 5 or 6 years in the city. I guess I've always had a natural gift, a modest gift for writing. And I wrote, some stories when I was a kid. I wasn't writing constantly, but I wrote some stories when I was a child. And then in college, I wrote an undergraduate thesis on terrorism, of all things, very prescient. And then in my career in marketing, I did a great deal of writing and copywriting. So I was well equipped to write the nonfiction book. Writing the novel was a challenge because, of course, a novel is very different from a nonfiction book. In particular, you have to be able to, write a story that people will find entertaining. So my background in writing was varied, but I did not pick up writing books until a few years ago.
So when you were a kid, what was your dream? What did you want to be when you grew up?
I don't remember anything strongly about, I think at one point I wanted to be a fireman, and then I probably wanted to play first base for the New York Yankees. But Joe, I don't remember any specific motivating dream after that. I was very interested in playing sports coming up in grade school and high school and even in college, and I think that was my focus. I certainly never thought, interestingly, I never thought, boy, I want to be a writer. I want to write books. I came into copywriting, advertising and promotion writing in the course of earning a living, but I never set out to become a writer.
So we all have that moment in our lives as readers where there's a book or a story that captivates us, that parts the curtains and makes us want more. What was that book for you growing up? What was the book that ultimately gave you that love of reading?
The book that I can come back to over and over, and I still read it 2 or 3 times a year, is Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. That is a story that is, has so many levels and is delightful to a 10 or 11-year-old because of the adventures that Huck has, which are easy to understand, and is delightful to a grown adult because of its commentary on American life, particularly life in the South in, the 1840s and 50s. So that would be the book that stands out in my mind as really sticking with me from an early age.
So writers kind of have that lucky rabbit's foot in their pocket, the muse, so to speak. Who has been the muse, or let's even say hero, that's kind of propelled you in your writing and your career arc?
As far as the muse, I've always been, and this may be true of many writers or even most writers, I have always been a voracious reader. I went through a Winston Churchill phase in my life where I read, the giant biography of Winston Churchill and smoked cigars for a year or two. And, I've been through a phase where, a decade or so where I only read biographies. And I don't know, about 15 or 20 years ago, I started to read more fiction, and that's very rewarding. I picked out 3 or 4 books that were really inspiring when I thought I would write a novel. And in a way, for instruction, Joe, I read them in succession over and over and over again. So Huckleberry Finn is one of those books that was very inspiring. There's a book that was very, very well received in the 1970s called Ragtime by E.L. Doctorow. It's a brilliant, brilliant novel about American life at the turn of the 20th century. Read that over and over. And then for those of your listeners who know about nautical fiction, a genius Irish writer named Patrick O'Brien wrote a 19-book series on life in the British Navy during the Napoleonic Wars. That particular history is not of great interest to me, but the books are absolutely spellbinding in terms of describing what actual life was like back then. And so I read the first volume of his series. Again, I've probably read it 8 times. And again, just as much as anything to learn from how this author and the other authors I've described, handled storytelling. Annie Proulx, who wrote several successful books, including one called Wyoming Stories. Again, I read over and over to see how she handled dialogue and dialect. So those were my inspiration, but also textbooks while I was writing Jeep Show.
The thing about being a writer is there's this mincing of adrenaline and dopamine. And I'm curious, in the very beginning when you started writing stories, what was the first story that you wrote where you saw a reaction from somebody that validated what you were doing and made you feel like this is my calling in life, this is something I should be doing?
Well, the first story I wrote that got interest was, I think, in the 4th grade. My school in New York put out a simple publication of essays or stories written by the grammar school students. And I don't know if how much you've been in New York, Joe, but there are hot dog vendors on many corners in New York. Back when I was there, it was, I think it was 20 cents. But so I wrote a simple story about, approaching a hot dog vendor and buying a hot dog and what that was like. And it got great reception from the editor of this simple publication and was published. And, given that, that was my first writing success. Again, I didn't come away from that with the childlike, oh, I need to be a writer. I must be a writer. That came probably 15 or 20 years ago, after I went through some hard times and, started writing every day in a way as a emotional survival mechanism. Clearly I had some modest gift for writing. I love to read and I very much enjoy research. Joe, as you know, research is fun and writing is hard. So it was really, about 15 years ago that I realized I have to write. I have to write if I'm going to survive.
So the one thing about life is when we make it to this point, when you've been around for decades, we realize that being a human can be difficult. There's so many factors that come into it. But there's also that element of risk. What is one of the biggest risks that you've ever taken in your life?
First of all, getting married is a giant risk. It's underappreciated, but I put that right up there. I think that, publishing a book is, you put your heart and soul into it, and, if you're not balanced and perhaps experience, you can put too much stock into other people's reactions to it. So I think anytime you make a creative project, you are putting, you are taking a risk. And of course, you minimize the risk by understanding that, if you've done the best you can do, then, never mind what other people think. Joe, that's easy to say and hard to do. But that's kind of where I have gotten to. I have one of my fundamental observations about life, and I did not, come up with this phrase, but it's really important for artists of all kinds and people in general to understand the difference between success and excellence. Success is really not up to us. It depends on the opinion of other people. Timing can come into it. External factors you can be very lucky or you can be very unlucky. So it's really important for me, and I think it's an important lesson for everyone to focus on excellence, because excellence is within your control. If you are a musician, you can practice hard and you can practice in effective ways and you can make yourself excellent. You may or may not get success, but that's out of your control. And again, if you have done the work to make your music or to make your book or to make your cooking, or to make your sculpture excellent, you have to then relax and say, I've done my part. Let's see what fate and the universe have in mind.
That is such a great point you made, because there is that eternal tussle as an artist as to what success means, because there's a lot of people that will spend their lives creating artwork and creating words and stories that never really see the light of day, like a Hemingway or a Picasso.
Yeah.
So what is that real measuring stick? And it's interesting how you broke that down, because it really is about a personal level of evolution and excellence that you adhere to no matter what. And it's always, and I think it answers that eternal question as to why we do what we do, because at the end of the day, I know personally for me, creating, no matter what happens, I'm going to do it because it satisfies my soul. It stirs me and makes me feel the wonder of this world. And I think no matter what money we get or accolades, that's the bottom line, because you'll hear that from people all the time that get success and money. Sometimes they just want to strip it all away and just be a regular person again. There was a video I saw recently of Michael Jackson. They closed the supermarket down, right? And they let him shop and be a regular person. And I think sometimes we take these things for granted, because success is really about just the ability to create. And even if you just motivate and inspire one person, you've done what your heart told you needed to do.
Absolutely. And, going back to your good question about, when did I decide to be a writer? It's funny. I never in my conscious mind decided, but there was an unconscious drive, almost a daemon, that was just demanding that I practice this modest gift that, I think, I was born with, and then through all sorts of commercial and advertising writing, had exercised without really knowing it. So, when I did go through this very difficult period and was kind of sitting there, on the floor, on my back on the floor, dazed, I started to write. My instinct was to write down what I thought, how I thought I had gotten myself into this fix, and, how I thought I would survive it as a, happy, productive human being. So, now that I reflect on your question, I wasn't consciously aware that I needed to write, that I was a writer, but my unconscious was very firm on that point and led me to writing first the nonfiction book and then, to the fiction book, Jeep Show. So I had a calling, I just wasn't aware of it.
It's interesting, the act of writing and stringing all of that together to find some level of meaning or to get yourself out of a place, I think it's one of the best versions of therapy that human beings have intermingled in. It's created such a cathartic way for both the artist and the reader.
Absolutely, and certainly for me. And, one of the things, I started out my business career at the giant soap company, Procter Gamble, in Cincinnati. And the first thing they drilled into all of us green recruits was, until you've written it down, you haven't thought it through. And, I find that, one of the great advantages, and I tell this to young people I talk to, if you can learn how to write lucidly, you will have such an advantage in life, because most people in this world, even smart people and even, cannot write lucidly. And so, that was something that was drilled into me. In fact, I was at Procter Gamble, I was sent to remedial memo writing school, to learn, to have the Procter Gamble memo system drilled into me. And in fact, that's where I found out about Jim Hetzer, this entertainer in World War II. So yeah, Joe, I couldn't agree more. Writing is so important. And then for some of us, writing stories, I won't say it comes naturally. I find it very difficult, but it's something, for some of us, it's something that we want to do and possibly that we have to do. I am not a good verbal storyteller. I'm not, at a dinner party, I'm not the person rattling off fascinating stories or telling jokes. But what I find is, if I'm writing, I can tell stories and funny anecdotes and that kind of thing. So I guess it is following that the modest gift that I was born with, and then in my business writing career, I was, exposed to influences that many people are not.
That's wonderful. What a wonderful reflection. So let me ask you this. Of all of the things that you've accomplished and evolved into in your career arc, and in general, what are you ultimately the proudest of?
In general, I am ultimately the proudest of being a good enough father for my two sons. The best years of my life so far, and I've had a very easy, happy life, were spent when my sons were little and raising them. It was exhausting, but that's what I'm most proud of. I think in my career, what I'm most proud of is, in my business career, giving good value for money, doing the work that was in front of me as best as I could, and learning learning how to develop myself and others. I was I was not a cruel person, but I was not an empathetic person. As a young man, I was focused on myself and my career, and I learned along the way from my own hard times that everybody has their own burdens to carry, and let's not let's not put our burdens on other people as much as we can. So, I look on that as a great as an achievement for me. And then, yes, I'm very happy that I was able to write a good and successful, quote unquote successful, Joe, nonfiction book. And then I'm really pleased that I was able to tell this morale story about World War II because my father served overseas in World War II. And so not only is it an interesting topic, and as I said, not only am I very interested in morale and how we develop it and maintain it, but it makes me feel closer to my father when I am, when I tell this story and now read it, hold the book in my hands. And that's very, very important to me.
So at the end of the day, everyone out there has a perception of you, family, friends, all of your fans, everyone that knows you, but you ultimately run the show. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Wow, that's a challenging and interesting question. I would say, first of all, I think I am lucky. I was born in America to middle-class parents. I was given a fine education. So first of all, I think of myself as a very fortunate human being. Secondly, I think of myself as good enough. I'm a good enough father, good enough husband, good enough writer. And some people will say, oh, good enough isn't, that's not much. No, it actually is. To be good enough is a hard thing. So I guess, to put it in a nutshell, Joe, I think of myself as a very lucky person and someone who has consciously and unconsciously worked hard to be good enough in the really important roles in life.
Beautiful. What a great answer. Robert, this has been wonderful. Jeep Show is the newest book. If anyone wants to pick that up, any of your previous work, reach out to you, any of the good business, how do they do it?
I have a website called jeepshowbook.com. And that gives background. There's a contact form in there to ask me questions, and there's a link to buy Jeep Show. The full title is Jeep Show, a Trouper at the Battle of the Bulge, and Trouper is spelled in the entertainment way. So there's a link there to buy the book, or you can buy the book directly on Amazon or bookshop.com. But I would be delighted to hear from some of your listeners about their answers to the insightful and challenging questions you've asked, Joe.
Yes. No, you've been wonderful. What a great time. Thank you so much for opening up. Thank you for your story. Best of luck with everything. Have a great 2025.
It's been a real privilege. Take care, Joe.
Thanks for tuning in to another famous interview with Joe Dimino, where we cover the world of art, literature, business, spirituality, music, and more from around the globe. Our esteemed theme music was composed and produced by the great E.E. Pointer of Kansas City's River Cow Orchestra. If you want to hear more interviews, visit the Famous Interviews with Joe Dimino channel on YouTube. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.